Fill her up.
You're listening to the Gas Digital Network.
Good afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. This is probably the guest I have been most excited about from 2020. Legendary journalist, co-founder, and just recently left the Intercept. He broke the Edward Snowden story. A real role model, Glenn Greenwald, who is currently in Brazil. I have a lot to talk to you about because you have been such an important figure in terms of moving international culture. And I don't think that there's anyone out there who has done a better job of keeping or trying to keep journalism honest and trying to keep it dedicated to its committed mission. One of the issues I have is historically leftists, and you always identify as being on the left, have been very skeptical of corporate power. But it seems that when it's corporate journalism, that goes out the window. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. I think there is a clear transformation of values on the left, and not for the better, over the last, say, 2 to 3 decades. Part of what attracted me to the left in the first place was exactly that skepticism, not just toward corporate power, but also to government power, at least when it came to things like spying and national security and the intelligence agencies. It's always been based on this view that if power centers accumulate too much power, inevitably they're going to abuse it at the expense of the individual. And what you see is this increasing willingness on the part of the American left specifically, but I would say the Western left generally, to abandon that skepticism of corporate actors and start to believe that for some reason they can be induced to act in the interests of the marginalized or left-wing agenda, as long as they're vested with enough confidence, trust, and particularly power. And so you see things like people believing that Google and Facebook and Twitter, which until, a couple of years ago were widely regarded on anything of the center left as being authoritarian and oligarchical, that somehow they're going to censor and regulate our discourse benevolently and with the best of intentions. You see it as well with the liberal left's willingness to get behind the CIA and the intelligence community with their pronouncements concerning collusion between the Russian government and the Trump campaign, which ended up being discredited by the Mueller report and the close of the Mueller investigation, with arresting nobody for having done that. And even just a general willingness to even stand behind the FBI. It's not a coincidence that Wall Street and Silicon Valley overwhelmingly donated their money this year in 2020 to the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, because they know that that's where their popularity and their agenda resides.
One of the things that just recently disturbed me a lot, Chuck Todd had a senator on his show over the weekend, I believe on ABC News, and earlier this year, there was a huge brouhaha at the New York Times when they ran an op-ed from Senator Tom Cotton, where he was basically saying at a certain point with this civil unrest, you're going to have to send in the tanks, to use a euphemism. And they were outraged that they were being platformed. And I just sat there thinking, do you not see an issue with media elites telling sitting senators that they can't speak? If they are advocating disturbing things, I can't think of any entities that it's more important to hear what they're trying to put over.
Yeah, precisely. That mindset baffles me so much. It would be one thing if, there's a call on the New York Times not to open up its very valuable op-ed space to very fringe views, right? Like, I can understand them not wanting to publish outright racist greats from David Duke or, overt racist, because it represents a pretty small and unimportant part of the population, and it just doesn't need attention from the largest media outlets. We're talking about not just a sitting United States senator, but somebody who has been fairly well regarded. He went to the best schools, Tom Cotton did, but also was advocating a view that, although I disagreed with it firmly, which I don't want to see the military in the streets of the United States performing police functions, even though he was advocating a view I disagree with, it was nonetheless a view that polls showed roughly half of Americans, if not more, supported. And so I personally, if a U.S. senator and other influential people are expressing views that I dislike, I want to have them see the light of day. I want to be able to know what they're saying. I want to be able to dissect them and debate them rather than being unaware that they exist. You know, there have been calls in the last year and a half. It was actually led by Kamala Harris in one of the few debates she participated in before dropping out of the presidential race with 0 votes because her campaign was such a failure. One of the only things that she advocated that was of any note was she was demanding that Twitter, a year ago, kick off Donald Trump. Why would you want the president of the United States, in command of the largest and most powerful military in human history, silenced and have us not know what he's thinking and planning and believing? It's lunacy. But it's kind of based on this idea, this liberal left idea now that if you're kept away from unpleasant things, if like a parent figure protects you from them, they can't hurt you anymore. They just kind of disappear. It's a very childish way of looking at the world, but it's definitely pervasive among a lot of liberals.
I was born in the Soviet Union. I did a book about North Korea. And to me, it is shockingly naive and disturbing how people seem to be oblivious to what authoritarianism is capable of, both in the past and in current times. There was a piece I read from you, and I could almost feel you through the screen, like flipping out at your keyboard, when the New York Times was basically referring to Yair Bolsonaro as the Trump of the tropics and trying to have some kind of equivalence between the two. And this is someone who has advocated just murdering his opponents, and is in a position in some cases to actually do it. Can you walk me through what you felt like when it's something as prestigious as the New York Times making this kind of very simple-minded equivocation? Yeah,
so, you can look at that in two ways, that idea that Bolsonaro was the Trump of the tropics. One is just kind of like a benign, ignorance-based attempt on the part of Western media outlets, which don't pay attention very much to Latin America and whose readers know almost nothing about Brazil, to find a familiar U.S. prism through which Bolsonaro could be explained. And so they're essentially saying, Donald Trump? Of course you know Donald Trump. Bolsonaro is very similar. And they do have superficial similarities. Bolsonaro likes Trump a lot. He has consciously copied some of his more effective rhetorical and political appeals. But they're wildly different in so many ways. Bolsonaro is a much more dangerous and extremist figure, as you just said. He was a member of the military dictatorship that ruled Brazil from 1964 until 1985. In 1964, the CIA worked with right-wing Brazilian generals to overthrow the democratically elected government in Brazil because they were concerned that they were becoming too center-left, or they were concerned that they would start to gravitate toward Moscow, which wasn't true, but that was the concern of the Kennedy and then Johnson administration. So they overthrew the government, the Brazilian democracy that had been a model for the region, and imposed this brutal 21-year dictatorship, military dictatorship that imprisoned journalists, killed dissidents, exiled artists, all the things that dictatorships do. And Jair Bolsonaro was a young army captain who served in the army. He wasn't a leader of the dictatorship, but he was a member of the military that enforced it. And even when Brazil finally re-democratized because of popular protests in 1985, and then had their first direct presidential election in 1989, Bolsonaro ran for Congress 30 years ago and won on a platform of saying that actually the military dictatorship is a superior form of government. And he kind of drew attention to himself with quotes that were at the time regarded as taboo. People would say, if you were to be elected president, what would be the first thing you would do? And he would say, I would close Congress on the first day. Congress serves no purpose. When he was asked what his criticisms were of the dictatorship, he would say they tortured a lot of people, but they didn't kill enough of them.
Yeah.
So he has a long record of espousing, explicit despotism, barbaric tyranny in a way that Trump never has. And Brazil is a much more fragile democracy because instead of being 230 years old, it's only 35 years old, and its institutions are much weaker. Its ability to resist incursions, much less. And so the whole comparison was so deceitful part of it was self-glorification, right? Like if you're a New York Times reporter or you're a political activist, it's more exciting to believe that you're actually fighting off some new Nazi Hitler-like figure than it is just fighting a standard Republican who just has some different stylistic flourishes, which is what Trump was. But it was also, a kind of orthodoxy that engulfed the liberal intelligentsia. They actually convinced themselves of it, that Trump wasn't just an ordinary democratically elected president who was going to leave if he lost, but was really kind of a dictator figure. They started ultimately calling him Hitler. And so in their minds, that comparison to Bolsonaro made sense.
Yeah, in 2015, there was even a headline where he was called Antichrist because the Pope had some kind of passive aggressive dig against him, and it's like he's not the Antichrist supposed to be charismatic. I mean, Trump certainly has his followers, but we've got a long way to go before you're bringing about the end of the world. How much do you think? I know you and I share an extreme skepticism of the war machine, and how much the corporate press beats the war drums and has had some kind of very, very life and death consequences for millions of people. How much of the animosity towards Trump do you feel is a consequence of his, at least explicitly stated, skepticism toward internationalism?
A lot. It's funny. I mean, literally 2 minutes before I came on your show, I just ended up publishing an article in my Substack column, where I now am, about exactly that question. It's amazing that you asked me that. It's a fascinating story. There's this, the first time I ever wrote about WikiLeaks was in 2010, early 2010, months before they published their first really big leaks of the collateral murder video and the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs and the diplomatic cables. Very few people knew who WikiLeaks was at the time. And what called my attention was a document they had published, which is a classified document from the CIA, which had been leaked to WikiLeaks. The purpose of which was to express severe worry about what the CIA called growing anti-war sentiment in Western Europe. The Dutch government had just lost its election. The government fell in part because the people of Holland were so angry that the government had spent 9 years fighting in a war that they thought had nothing to do with their lives and didn't have any benefit for them. And they were petrified, the CIA was, that this anti-war sentiment was going to contaminate the rest of Western Europe, particularly France and Germany. And the idea was, how do we figure out how to manipulate public opinion so that that doesn't happen, so that France and Germany also aren't forced to withdraw from Afghanistan, leaving us alone? And their conclusion was, aside from the need to exploit Afghan women and pretend the war is about helping feminism or whatever.
Yeah.
The main strategy was to use Barack Obama's popularity to say, look, there's this cosmopolitan, highly educated, sophisticated Harvard Law graduate, African-American, sophisticate whom you love, people of Berlin and Paris. And by putting him as the face on this war that he would then prettify, they concluded correctly that it would increase the levels of support for the war in Afghanistan among Western European populations, and it worked. And I think one of the reasons why the CIA despised Trump so early on, that whole kind of deep state nationalist, military industrial complex, was twofold. One, that he did question a lot of their pieties, right? Like, he ran his campaign against the war on terror, against the Iraq war, against regime change war in Libya and Syria, particularly in Syria, which was underway and which they wanted to expand, and he was raging against it, even questioning the ongoing utility of NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union. The original justification of NATO, of course, was to prevent Soviet expansion westward, and with no more Soviet Union, he was like, why do we need NATO anymore? A very good question that you're not allowed to ask. So part of it was just his questioning of their pieties, but I think a big part of it was Trump has no willingness and no ability to put that pretty bow on U.S. imperialism around the world. I recall, as I was writing that article in 2017, you probably remember, Bill O'Reilly was interviewing him on Fox News and asked him about what Bill O'Reilly claimed was his excessively high tolerance for Putin, given that Putin kills journalists and kills dissidents. And Trump responded by saying, oh, what, you think we're so innocent? There are a lot of killers in the world. And the rage level was through the roof over that comment. Not because anyone doubts that it's true. Everyone, of course, knows that it is true. The U.S. has always had lots of killers in its employ. They were angry because the U.S. president isn't supposed to tell the truth and show the real face of the United States to the world. And that's what Trump did for 4 years, whether wittingly or not. And I think that was what accounted for a lot of the hostility toward him.
I am really excited that Sheath Underwear is sponsoring this week's show. I'm a huge supporter of Sheath Underwear, and Sheath Underwear supports me. If you use promo code Malice20, you get 20% off your order at sheathunderwear.com. What are they? They're boxer briefs that are super comfortable. And what's unique about Sheath is they have dual pouches to support you down there. Guys, I'm telling you, if you try it, you'll swear by it. I wear them every single day. If you go to sheathunderwear.com, use promo code Malice20, you get 20% off your order. These were made by an Iraq veteran because it gets very hot in the desert, and this is a great way to keep yourself cool. In Brazil, too. It gets hot there, from my understanding. I don't leave my house, so I wouldn't know. I guess I'm a voluntary Julian Assange. If you go to sheathunderwear.com, use promo code Malice20, you get 20% off the most comfortable underwear you'll ever own. And I can say that with a straight face. Let's get back to the show. There's a story that recently broke that I am kind of beside myself isn't like page one scandal every single day, which is that, and the fact that journalists were laughing about this still sends chills up my spine, that apparently they lied to the commander-in-chief about how many troops are in Syria so that he would be discouraged from removing them. And I don't understand how, I don't know if this is treason or sedition, but at the very least, this seems to be a very, very disturbing precedent that bears investigation.
You think? The whole premise of the United States government and how we function is that we're supposed to have civilian control over the military. And, we were talking earlier about the strain of authoritarianism on the left that trusts corporations now, like Silicon Valley giants, trusts the CIA and the FBI and the deep state. Journalists are, I think, the most authoritarian of all. It's journalists who have led the way, for example, in demanding that Silicon Valley giants censor more and more people, which is incredible to me, right? You go into journalism and then you start agitating for censorship. It's like, becoming a doctor and urging people to smoke more cigarettes. It's completely anathema to the function. But they're also incredibly enamored of the explicit efforts of the Pentagon and the CIA to openly subvert the democratically elected president. This was going on really early. If you go back to early 2017, there were leaks in the Wall Street Journal and otherwise where the CIA was saying we're purposely excluding or omitting classified information in the president's daily briefing because we don't trust him to keep it a secret. We believe he might tell Russia. Now, whether or not that was really true or whether it was just CIA leaks designed to cast him as some kind of like Kremlin agent is secondary to the fact that the reaction of the media was not, wait a minute, the CIA has no right to manipulate and deceive the president and decide what he can and can't. Nobody elected the CIA. We elected the president. He's the one under the Constitution in charge of the executive branch, of which the CIA is a part. If you have the CIA acting in this rogue fashion of deciding what information they're going to give to the president and what information they won't give to him, it is basically a coup, a constitutional coup. It's a subversion of the constitutional order, just like the example you just referenced of the media reports that they purposely lied to the president about troops being withdrawn from Syria when in fact they were just kind of playing shell games with him because the military believed that we ought to stay in Syria and resisted and impeded Trump's efforts to withdraw troops. That ought to provoke, no matter what your opinions are of Trump or of the war in Syria, extreme they're so obsessed right now with norms, democratic norms, and coups. That's what that is. That is a deep state coup, an attempt by the CIA and the Pentagon to steal from the president what the Constitution gives him, which is the role of commander-in-chief and the right to make decisions about foreign policy, and arrogate it unto themselves.
I can imagine a parallel situation, like let's suppose the FDA had a vaccine approved, but they were sitting on their hands until Biden is sworn in. And on some level, people would be excusing this. But if you sat down for 2 seconds and thought about this, this is literally life and death and this is an entire nation that is at stake, and to just abrogate that power to yourself, I still am surprised at how cavalier, and there were on Twitter, there were journalists laughing about it. They were using the laughing emoji. And I do you think they've gotten worse in the last, let's suppose, 4 years, or have they always been this bad?
Oh, no, I think I've always been a critic of the U.S. media. I started a blog in order to critique them. I created a media outlet in order to counteract and subvert them. So I've never been a fan of the U.S. corporate media since I began paying close attention to politics. But there's no question it's gotten radically unhinged and way off the deep end in the last 4 years. And it's not hard to understand why. It relates back to what we were discussing earlier, which is if you convince yourself that the president is an actual despot, that he's a tyrant, that he's a dictator, that he poses an existential threat to democracy, that he's even like a Hitler-like figure, that he commands this kind of like white supremacist terrorist ring, that he gives orders to the Proud Boys, that is like this formidable, insurrectionary fascist militia organization, as opposed to like a bunch of fringe, obese, overweight losers role-playing. If you convince yourself of all of that, which they have, then it becomes justified to do anything in the name of stopping the president. Getting the military to step over their boundaries, lying in order to undermine their president, concealing information that might help him, publishing false information that would weaken him. I mean, if you're really facing Hitler, then all the rules of the game change. And that's what they persuaded themselves they were doing, and still believe, that they were and are confronting in a very courageous and self-sacrificing manner a menace to democracy and the American way of life. And therefore they believe, like all overly righteous people do, that anything they do is justifiable.
How concerned are you about the increased possibility of war under a Biden administration?
Well, there's no way you can be concerned if you just look at the people already he's appointing, and if you look at the record of the Obama administration. During the Obama presidency, 8 predominantly Muslim countries were bombed in a sustained and prolific manner over the course of 8 years. The last year of the Obama presidency, 2016, something like 28,000 bombs were dropped on various parts of the Muslim world. I think it ended up being something like a bomb every 3 hours, something like that on average. They initiated a new war in Libya, not with any claim that the Libyan government was posing a threat to the United States, but simply because of this humanitarian argument that we have the right to change governments using military force to help people around the world, not because Libya was an oil-rich country whose petroleum was desperately needed by France and the UK. And they initiated a bombing campaign in partnership with the Saudis over Yemen, the poorest country on the planet, that created the worst humanitarian crisis the earth knows. Millions of people who are food secure are even on the brink of starvation. And then on top of that, if you look at the people who already have been indicated for top national security positions, like Jake Sullivan, who today was unveiled as President-elect Biden's national security advisor, what he's been doing over the last 4 years is partnering with CIA and neocons like Michael Morrell and Michael Chertoff and Bill Kristol to form this new axis of foreign policy advocacy, the intelligence agencies, the Democratic Party, and the Bush-Cheney neocons, to be more belligerent toward Moscow, to want to confront the war on terror in a more aggressive way, to change regimes that we dislike, to arm Ukraine, to topple Assad. So it isn't like President Trump was some kind of peacenik president, right?
Sure.
He did escalate the bombing campaigns in Iraq and Syria as he promised he would do, and caused a lot of civilian deaths. But he didn't start any new wars. That's just a fact. He's the first president in several decades about whom one can say that. And it would be shocking to me, if we got past the first 4 years of a Biden-Harris administration without at least one new war being initiated.
Yeah, it's something I'm very concerned about as well. Here's something either you might have insight about or inside information about. I'm sure you remember in 2007, 2008, Barack Obama campaigned against the Iraq War. He campaigned it. He used this as a cudgel every chance he got against McCain and against sitting President Bush. It seemed that he meant it. He had voted against the Iraq War previously. And then as soon as he gets into office, like, it was just in many ways a continuation of the same thing. Do you think he was just lying the whole time, or do you think it's the kind of thing where when you become president, they sit you down and they're like, all right, here's what's really going to happen and you're going to follow orders?
Well, it's interesting. I think Obama ended up being extremely lucky because at the time of the Iraq War in 2002 and then 2003, he wasn't in the U.S. Senate. He didn't get to the Senate until 2004. He was representing an extremely liberal district in Illinois, in the Illinois State Legislature, Hyde Park, which is where the University of Chicago is, and various just college liberals, where it was politically required of him to oppose the Iraq War. Had he supported the Iraq War, his career would have been over. He never would have won the Democratic primary for Senate in Illinois. But even in that opposition that he voiced in 2002, he made clear he wasn't some kind of an anti-imperialist. He even said his famous line, "I'm not against war, I'm just against stupid wars." And I don't think there's any question that had he been in the Senate, where he ended up being aligned with that kind of center-left pro-war imperialist policies of people like Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, both of whom voted for the Iraq War, that whole centrist wing of the Democratic Party, he would have likely voted for it as well. It's a counterfactual I can't prove, and we'll never know. I'm just saying that I think we have to remember that at the time he wasn't in the Senate like Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden were. He was representing a tiny little hyper leftist district in Illinois. And then in 2007 and 2008, not only did he run against the Iraq War, he also ran against essentially the entire Bush-Cheney framework of how the war on terror was being prosecuted. He wanted to close Guantanamo. He wanted to end domestic spying. He wanted to end renditions. He wanted to end the use of the state secrets privilege to hide what the government was doing in court. And as soon as he got in, not only didn't he end the war in Iraq, as you say, and not only didn't he escalate the war in Afghanistan, which he kind of promised to do, but he also continued almost every one of those Bush-Cheney terrorism policies that he campaigned in vain against on both moral and strategic grounds. I think part of the reason that happened is because the real Obama is an accommodationist. He always has been. There's not a revolutionary bone in his body. He doesn't believe in confronting power centers. He believes in appeasing them and kind of worming his way up. That's always been his strategy, and so that's what he did. But I absolutely do believe that, when you're a young, politician who's been in the Senate for all of 3 years, 2 years really, and then running for president, who has had no experience with the intelligence community and the deep state, and you sit in that Oval Office and guys come in with their big, medals on their chests and their secret briefing books, and they scare the shit out of you by saying, unless you authorize this program, there's going to be terrorist attacks on your watch that we will leak to the press as your fault for having ordered these programs stopped. Then either because of political calculation or because of conviction or some combination of both, you go along to get along. This is the most important thing that I think has happened in the last 4 years. Even though it's kind of like a small snippet, it was so revealing. I think it explained what you just asked me about. I'm sure you've seen this. I posted it a lot. In early 2017, before Trump was even inaugurated, days before, he was kind of tweaking the CIA, mocking them on Twitter about how they got Iraq WMDs wrong. And he was angry at them because they were leaking to the press that the Russians were the reason he had won, and felt like they were trying to undermine the legitimacy of his presidency by saying he only won because of Russia. And so that was his way of getting back. And Chuck Schumer went on the Rachel Maddow show, and she asked him about that, about isn't it extraordinary that he's not even president yet, and yet he's attacking his own intelligence agency. Like, she's a liberal, offended that Trump is criticizing the CIA, right?
Yeah, the CIA. Yeah.
So what Schumer said was, ethics aside, just as a hard-nosed businessman that he claims to be, it's really stupid to confront and attack and anger and upset the CIA, because if you do that, in his words, they have 6 different ways until Sunday of getting back at you. And she asked him, well, what does that mean? What are they going to do? And he says, I don't know what they're going to do to him, but I know they're extremely upset about what he's saying about them and how they're being treated. So if you're Obama, who's doesn't have the same personality as Trump, you don't want that. Everyone in Washington knows you don't fuck with the CIA because they'll do to you what they did to Trump. And so I think he got into office and said, I want to pass a healthcare bill. I want to, get credit for turning the economy around. I don't want to go to war with the CIA, so I'll let them keep doing what they're doing.
This is a sponsor that really is of great importance with this episode. It's called UBDI. If you've seen The Social Dilemma, you know big tech companies use your data to your detriment. They manipulate what you see. They control where your data goes. They leave you devoid of data property rights. Now, we can't stop YouTube from censoring Ron Paul, but you can take your data and attention away from platforms like Facebook, like Twitter, like Reddit, God forbid. UBDI helps you understand and visualize the data these companies store on you as you build a digital asset library only you own and control. And with UBDI, you can enter into verified, bot-free tribes of people. It's like joining a fitness community. And inside these verified groups, you can see your Robinhood trades. You can see the shows people are binging on Netflix. You like crypto? I'm sure a lot of you do. You can see what members are trading. If you go to ubdi.com or download UBDI on the Apple Store or Google Play, and you could check this out. This is the next step of controlling your online information. Let's get back to the show. Here, something hopefully that you can explain to me the psychology involved. For a bit of time, we were told there's no deep state, there's no deep state, there's no deep state. This is Trumpian paranoia. And then overnight, it felt like the story was, thank God for the deep state. It's keeping Trump in check. When people switch this line, it reminds me back of like the Comintern days, right? Well, they would just overnight, it went from like, we have to all work together to like, we have to be at a war, then we have to all work together. Are these people dishonest, delusional? What's the psychology going on there as you can best gather?
So I think I think it's a media problem, first of all. And it's interesting. I kind of had a front row seat to that whole deep state debate because as somebody who's been steeped for a long time, well before Trump, in leftist foreign policy critiques, the deep state is something that, is commonplace. Like it's commonplace vernacular for leftist foreign policy scholars and critics to use. Books have been written by respected journalists called The Deep State, talking not about Turkey or Egypt, but the United States. The idea that there's a permanent power faction in Washington that exerts more power than the president and exists, as presidents come and go. Dwight Eisenhower warned about, right? He had like 12 minutes to talk to the American people after being in office 8 years and riding off into the sunset. And he chose to warn them about the power of what he called the military-industrial complex. And then mid-January of 2017, I wrote an article headline, "The Deep State Goes to War with the Democratically Elected President," talking about what was already evident in this conflict between the CIA and Trump. And not only people on the left who claim that I taught the people on Fox News and on the right to use the term deep state, but also some idiots on the right too, like Rush Limbaugh, did several segments giving me credit for coining the term deep state. The reality was the deep state is a thing that has existed for a long time, because if you don't understand the existence of the deep state, you don't understand anything about American politics.
Yeah.
So then why were journalists mocking the idea that there's a deep state and saying that you have to be a conspiratorial idiot to believe in that, even though it's so central? It's like a fundamental truth about U.S. foreign policy. The reason is this media model that has emerged in the wake of the internet era and the difficulty of sustaining a profitable model for how to do journalism has been to silo off into hyper-partisan corners, only speak to a vehemently ideological and or partisan audience and feed them what they need in order to feel anger and fear and hatred of the other tribe and validation about their own. And when you do that, when that is your model, that's your profit model, and then it becomes the way that you see the world because you're just repeating it over and over, doing things like one day waking up and mocking the idea of a deep state as something that only conspiratorial crazies believe in, but then the next day saying, thank God for these unelected military and intelligence officials who are protecting our democracy against the elected president, the very definition of a deep state. That contradiction doesn't matter, because the only thing that matters is, are you saying what pleases your readers, what gets them excited and animated and behind you, believing that buying your subscriptions or, watching your show is what will keep them safe from incursions into democracy. That's the media model that is now predominant. And so that's the discourse just reflects that.
What was your reaction, and I'm sure it was very similar to mine, when Bernie Sanders, who is like as much of a, maybe I'm wrong in your opinion, but like an heir to like the Eugene McCarthy left of the late 60s, to have Bernie Sanders on TV defending the CIA and its integrity, to me that seemed like one of the most Alice in Wonderland moments, and it kind of went under the radar.
Yeah, I mean, remember, Bernie, you could say Bernie, in the mid 70s and 80s was to the left of Eugene McCarthy.
Oh, yeah.
Eugene McCarthy was, kind of an establishment figure despite his opposition to the war in Vietnam, right? I mean, that was the one thing that made Eugene McCarthy, kind of the Howard Dean or the Bernie Sanders of his era, meaning like young college students, anti-war college students traveled around the country, canvassing him for the like. But, unions, for example, hated McCarthy. They loved Hubert Humphrey because Humphrey was much more pro-union than McCarthy was. He was, it's just sort of like a byproduct of design. Whereas Bernie in the 70s and 80s was like a real leftist. He like traveled to Havana and Nicaragua and came back and heralded the Nicaraguan and Cuban healthcare systems as being models that we ought to emulate, and was kind of a real hardcore devoted anti-Cold Warrior, and was just the kind of mayor of Burlington, a left-wing city, and had that space to do that. And then even when he ran for Congress and then the Senate, he thought the Democratic Party was too far to the right to even become a member of it. He ran as an independent, and he's still technically not a part of the Democratic Party. And so I think that's such a good observation. The fact that even now someone like Bernie Sanders, I think, has been so inebriated by this kind of melodramatic, exaggerated, manufactured script about who Trump is and the threat he represents, has become so convinced of the need to align with whatever entities appear to be resisting Trump, that he's now even willing to defend the honor of the CIA, the agency that was causing genocide and death squads in the very Central American region that he once expressed his solidarity with over and over. And so that's just kind of a microcosm of what has happened on the American left.
As someone who was born in the Soviet Union, watching the NSA be created, which is in many ways similar to the KGB, the idea that, you're the one who kind of broke that story with Snowden and kind of this just complete shredding of any kind of civil liberties when it comes to people who are perfectly innocent. There's not even a pretense of them being, suspected of any crime. What has been the fallout for you personally as a result of breaking such a big story?
At the time, my role in the U.S. media was very tenuous. I had, begun not as a New York Times reporter, the Washington Post reporter, the kind of person that normally gets national security leaks of this magnitude. But I just started my own blog in 2005. I got hired as a columnist by Salon, and then I was only at The Guardian for 8 months at the time the story broke. And the person with whom I mostly reported the story, Laura Poitras, was unaffiliated with any media outlet. She was a documentary filmmaker. And so we were very much on the kind of outskirts of the U.S. media on purpose. I mean, we were, we disliked the U.S. media and purposely separated ourselves from them. And I remember very well, at the time there was this immediate effort on the part of those media outlets to delegitimize the reporting that we were doing. The first article the New York Times wrote about me, like the day or the second day after I published the first story at The Guardian, the headline was something like, what was it called? It was anti-surveillance activist finds himself at the center of NSA controversy. Okay. And then, it was an attempt to read me out of journalism, to say that like I shouldn't get the benefits of free press protections legally which I was very worried about because the New York Times called me an activist. And then when people revolted on my behalf, they changed the headline, which I think you can, if you go there to that article now, you'll see the changed headline, but the URL still reflects the original. I think it now says anti-surveillance blogger finds himself. I was a fucking reporter at one of the oldest and most influential papers in the West, in The Guardian. I was reporting one of the most significant stories in a generation, but to the New York Times, they had to call me a blogger, or an activist and a blogger. And then I went to meet the press, I think the second or third week of the reporting, and David Gregory rather notoriously asked me twice why it is that I also shouldn't be in prison, along with Edward Snowden. Imagine a fellow journalist on television asking me why I shouldn't be imprisoned for doing this reporting. And then the next day, Andrew Ross Sorkin, the New York Times Wall Street columnist and CNBC host, essentially said the same thing. He said, I think Glenn Greenwald ought to be in handcuffs, and then apologized the next day. And from there, politicians like Peter King and people in the Democratic Party started saying the same thing, that I had to be prosecuted, that I had to be arrested. And so for about 10 months, I didn't feel comfortable leaving Brazil, where I was living and doing the reporting, because the Holder Justice Department was being very coy, publicly and privately, about whether I'd be arrested if I tried to enter the United States. And it wasn't until the week of the Pulitzers being announced, when we were pretty certain we were likely to win, but we had already been announced as award winners of the Polk, the second most prestigious journalism award for investigative reporting. And the ceremony was that same week, and there was a room full of journalists, and Laura and I calculated we would gamble and go back to the U.S. and see what happens. We didn't think they would arrest us the same week when the Pulitzers were being announced and we were going to get the Polk. And then they didn't. But for a good year, the U.S. government was very threatening. People forget that the British government sent agents into the Guardian newsroom in London and stood over them and forced them to destroy physically the computers on which their copy of the Snowden archive was kept. And they also detained my husband when he was traveling from visiting Laura in Germany back to Rio de Janeiro through Heathrow Airport for 9 hours under a terrorism law, and threatened to arrest him and prosecute him, and started a criminal proceeding against him. So they got very thuggish and very threatening. A lot of the people in the media led the way. But ultimately, I think, the story ended up being vindicated. I mean, we did win, the Pulitzer and every other journalism award. The film that Laura made about our work with Snowden won an Oscar. And I think Snowden ended up being very vindicated, because the programs we exposed as a result of his heroic whistleblowing have been repeatedly found to have been in violation of the Constitution and the law.
How do you have any inside information? And you don't have to answer this, obviously, if you're not comfortable. Is there any possibility of Snowden being pardoned by President Trump on his way out?
Well, it's something we're definitely working on. I would call it my top priority at the moment. Not just a pardon of Snowden, but also of Julian Assange. If Julian Assange doesn't get a pardon, he's going to die in prison.
By design.
If Snowden doesn't get a pardon, oh yeah, exactly. They want him dead. If Snowden doesn't get a pardon, he'll probably end up in Russia for the rest of his life. He's about to have his first child with his American-born and American wife, Lindsay Krause. And, he wants his son to be born in the United States because that's his country, not Russia. He didn't choose to be in Russia. People forget he was trying to transit through. So we're hoping that once President Trump gets past his current fixation on the election outcome, that he will begin to realize that one of the most important powers the Constitution vests in him is the power of pardoning, and that the same people who abuse their powers against his campaign and against his presidency to spy on him, to leak, to engage in all sorts of clandestine disinformation, are the same people that both Julian Assange and Edward Snowden risked their liberty in order to expose. And the only ones who would be angry if he were to pardon either of them or both are people like John Brennan and Susan Rice, and James Clapper and Jim Comey. People on the right and the left would cheer President Trump for a historic defense of transparency and the right of the people to be free of rule by this unelected security state.
Some people might not realize John O'Brien is his Twitter handle. He was former head of the CIA. Well, someone else happened to buy johnobrien.com. And if you go to that website, it redirects to a Trump fundraising page. So I'm not naming names, but you might be talking to him right now. So I guess his intelligence isn't what it was, all it was wanted.
Yeah, you got to copy their methods and learn from them.
Hey, that's exactly correct. I saw Edward. I've been on Rogan a few times. I saw Snowden was on not that long ago. Is he in hiding? Like, what's his quality of life like in Russia?
Well, ironically, in addition to writing that article that I told you about 2 minutes before coming on with you, I also interviewed him earlier today, and I'm going to have that interview up tomorrow, kind of about the state of online internet freedom and censorship and the like. You know, he's in a country that he didn't choose to be in, that he has no connection to, and he can't leave.
Yeah.
But at the same time, when we were in Hong Kong meeting with him, our working assumption was that it was about 97 or 98% likely that he was going to end up in the hands of the U.S. government and go to prison for the rest of his life. And not like a fun, easy, club fed kind of prison, but like the prison that you go to when they accuse you of harming U.S. national security. Like the kind where you're in a cell by yourself for 23 hours a day or 23 and a half hours a day. And that was going to be the rest of his life. That was what was so brave about his choice.
Like Ross Ulbricht.
So when you compare what we expected and what exactly. And what they'll do to Julian Assange for sure if they get their hands on him here. So when you compare what his expectation was of his life when he did this versus the reality of his life, which is, okay, yes, he's in Russia, but he's in Russia with his longtime girlfriend, who's now his wife, who's expecting their first child. He is able freely to participate in the debate that he galvanized around the world about internet freedom and abuse of government secrecy. He speaks, he earns a good living, making appearances. He wrote a best-selling book. He works as the president of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, which is an organization that I co-founded with Daniel Ellsberg and Laura Poitras and others in defense of press freedom. I'd say his life is very fulfilling. And the thing that is most fulfilling about it is that I always say this and people don't believe me, but it's really true. Of all the people I know in the world, the person who is at most at peace with themselves is Edward Snowden, because every night he gets to put his head on his pillow, knowing that when confronted with the choice of protecting his own immediate material interests or sacrificing those in defense of the values and causes he believes in, he chose the latter. And when you are able to live with yourself, knowing that you didn't just speak your values, but live them, it really does foster this incredible internal peace that makes you a very happy and fulfilled person, regardless of what other limitations you might have.
I know that there's been threats against your life in Brazil as well. How secure are you in your personal safety?
Yeah, well, because of that reporting, the reporting that I did all last year in Brazil that exposed corruption by the Bolsonaro government, we've been under death threats. My husband's a member of Congress, a left-wing member of Congress with the Socialist Party, so he's an opponent of Bolsonaro's. One of the only openly gay members of the entire Congress in a country ruled by a movement that became very virulently anti-gay, kind of exploited the anti-gay sentiments to propel itself to power, convincing people that the gay movement wanted to turn their children into objects of sex and pedophilia and the like, a very powerful and dangerous thing to convince people of. And then with the reporting that I did, the death threats became so specific for both of us and so intense that neither of us have left our house without armed security or an armored vehicle. One of our best friends in March of 2018, who served on the city council of Rio de Janeiro with my husband, he was a city council member at the time, Marielle Franco, was assassinated because of her work with bullets pumped into her head in her car at 9:00 at night on the streets of Rio. So it's a country where there's real political violence. The government is trying to imprison me for that reporting. They criminally charged me. A judge threw out the charges in January, but they're now appealing that ruling, so they're still trying to imprison me as well. But I feel like with the passage of time, the Bolsonaro movement has kind of found other enemies that are of higher priority to it than us. So that has alleviated some of the pressure somewhat.
Whose life would you say is in greater danger, Julian Assange or Jim Acosta?
Jim Acosta would say Jim Acosta for sure. Yeah, I mean, I can't look at the cover of Jim Acosta's book. What is it like? The title of that fucking book is like Danger, Reporting and Confronting the President in Trump's America or whatever. With this like perfectly coiffed hair and like coming out of the CNN studio. But that's been the conceit all along, right, of the press, is that they're in danger, when in reality, the only real threat to press freedom is one that they never cared about, the one being imposed on Julian Assange, because he's not one of them.
Yeah. Are you safe to travel to the United States?
Yeah. So, after that first year, I've traveled, that first time we entered the U.S. With not a lot of tranquility and entered without being detained. We assumed that if they didn't do it then, they weren't ever going to do it. So I've traveled to the U.S. More or less problem-free ever since.
As someone who was born in the Soviet Union and who understands how malevolent some of these state forces are, when you pulled the trigger and started exposing the Snowden stuff, how long was it until you're like, okay, I can breathe freely, I'm not going to wake up and someone's going to be in my house? Because that's what I would imagine is going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it was a while. It was a good number of months, because what happened was, when I traveled back to Brazil from Hong Kong, I had in my possession all the thumb drives that contained the many, many hundreds of thousands, if not more, documents that Snowden had given me. So on my possession were the most sensitive documents from the most secretive agency within the world's most powerful government. And I wasn't even that worried about what the U.S. government would do, because I made very clear publicly there was no way to stop the reporting, that there were plenty of copies of that archive stored safely around the world, so that even if they took mine or did something to me that would benefit them in no way, the documents would still be reported. My bigger concern was the other governments or non-state actors that had a high interest level in getting their hands on those documents. That was really my big worry. And I would anytime I had to leave my house, I always had a backpack with me to make sure that at least one copy of that archive was with me at all time. So I'd go to the supermarket, and I'd be picking out poultry or produce or whatever next to, like Brazilian couples. And I would just kind of laugh about thinking about what was on my back.
Yeah.
And then, I think once the climate in the UK got very ugly, there were a constant drumbeat in Murdoch papers for the editors of The Guardian to be arrested and prosecuted. And then when they detained my husband under that terrorism law, and then the Justice Department started telling my lawyers that they wouldn't give me assurances of safe passage if I tried to enter the U.S., definitely the tension level was very high, and it stayed high for a good number of months, probably until we traveled back to the U.S. and then kind of freely entered, won the Pulitzer, won the other things, and felt like, okay, the incentive for anyone to do anything drastic has diminished greatly. We tried really hard never to fall prey to paranoia, because if you're going to do something like that, you need to be aware of the risks.
Yeah.
Take the precautions that are reasonable to take against them, and then just get on with the work. Like if you sit there every minute worrying about what car is on your street and what noise has been made or you'll be paralyzed with fear, which is part of what they want. So we really had to train ourselves not to focus too much on those risks, so that it didn't impede the work we had to do.
You very recently left the Intercept, which you co-founded. This is your baby, and you were there for years and went to Substack. I know you wrote about the reasons why, but on an emotional level, how hard was that? Or was it kind of like ripping off a Band-Aid?
It was both. The Intercept is something that I created at the height of the Snowden reporting. I used all the leverage I had, the visibility I had, the influence I had to create a new media outlet that I really believed was going to create a new way of doing journalism. It was going to provide a kind of editorial freedom that I believe was so lacking in U.S. media and so woefully lacking and harmfully lacking. And everything was kind of set up so perfectly. We had a funder with unlimited resources who was really committed to the vision, who had promised and kept his promise never to interfere in the editorial output. And we had this ability to just build something completely new. And to watch it descend into a very trite, banal betrayal of its original values, to just become another liberal left media outlet, especially in the wake of Trump's 2016 victory, kind of traumatized by the accusation that by doing their job and reporting on the Clinton and Podesta emails, they had helped Trump win, and therefore basically reconstructed itself in order to become an arm of the Democratic Party and to prove to the liberal left that they were on the right side, to start quoting CIA pronouncements uncritically, the way we were talking about earlier. To watch all that happen was very frustrating while I was there. And so leaving was kind of cathartic. I feel very liberated. But it is also very disappointing that something I poured a lot of my effort into that was built around my name and a couple of other people who I founded it with ended up being, in my view, such a kind of disappointment.
Glenn, we're running out of time. What has been your favorite part of this interview?
Well, I actually love the fact that, first of all, I believe you are reputed to be on the right. I would say a lot of your friends or listeners would identify you as such. And I also am, so I like the fact that there are so many common values that we can come together on and agree on and see similar dangers. And I also really like the fact that you grew up in an authoritarian society and use that experience to warn people of similar dangers that are emerging here in the United States, even though they might be taking a slightly different stylistic expression. That's been interesting to me to listen to you frame your questions based on that background. I think there's a really interesting political realignment taking place, not just in the United States, but in Western politics, where people who 10 years ago would have had very little in common politically now have a lot in common because of the framework has shifted so profoundly. And I feel like our discussion kind of illustrates that in a way I find interesting.
You are welcome.